Good afternoon, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today, we are hosting a most inspiring researcher, journalist, and author, Natasha Hakimi Zapata. We will be exploring her book, Another World is Possible, and this is the book, Lessons for America from Around the Globe, which is a really hopeful look at projects people have already accomplished. That's what's so great about it. It's not pie in the sky, it's happening now. And I believe this book is a template for a progressive agenda for 2026, 7, and 8, and beyond. But Natasha's book shows us how projects and policies that seem extraordinary to us in the US have actually been instituted in other countries around the world. Natasha is an award-winning journalist as well as a translator and university lecturer. She was born in Chicago to a Mexican mother and Iranian father. She lived in Mexico City and Los Angeles before moving to London, where she currently resides and where the program is coming from today. She received 4 bachelor's degrees, if that's not, I mean, that sounds amazing to me, but in Spanish language and literature from the Universidad de Complutense de Madrid and UCLA, and English literature from the University of Bristol in England, and another master's degree, I think, from Boston University, as well as UCLA. She's also been acclaimed by the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, who is one of our heroes at Praxis Peace Institute. So I want to welcome you, Natasha. It's just wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Georgia, and thank you everyone for being here.
I wanted to start with a quote from your book, which I found really important for us to think about, and it's certainly timely. And that is profound societal change is often rooted in moments of deep crisis. And I think we've seen many historical examples of that, and we are certainly in deep crisis today. So these examples that you bring forth, Natasha, are so important. And although in your book you start writing about the universal healthcare system in the UK, I would actually like to start our interview with some of the places you focused on that very few of us have knowledge of or have heard anything about. So I'd like to start with Uruguay and their record-breaking renewable energy transition. I'd like you to give us a little history on how the Uruguayans harnessed hydroelectric, wind, and solar power to create most of Uruguay's energy, and to tell us a bit about the political support from President Vasquez and the advantage of publicly owned utilities. If this isn't too many things to put into one question, uh, you could begin with how this started and how the renewable energy transition came to be in Uruguay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And just to, I'm seeing a comment from Katie that the book wasn't visible. I have my own copy here, so
Oh,
there
great.
it is. It's quite pink. And it's from the New Press. First of all, again, thank you so much for having me and for being such a close reader. I was saying before we started that it's a wonderful thing to work so long on a project and then to see it find its way into people's hands and to especially people who really take it quite seriously and find it engaging and inspiring. And so I might just, Georgia, if it's okay, I'm gonna take one step back before I go to Uruguay and just explain a little bit where the book kind of came from, if that's okay. And so
That's wonderful.
great. So the book kind of comes out of two parts of my life. One is very personal, which I talk about. And I'm sure when we talk about universal healthcare, we'll talk about it a little bit
Yes, you.
more. And so it comes out of I'm the daughter of undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Iran, as Georgia mentioned, and I grew up with this language of the American dream. I was the first in my family to go to college, and I should set the record straight. I only have 2 bachelor's degrees, but I did study in those different places, and so it seems like I have many more. But I was the first in my family to go to college. My brothers and I to get a college degree. My brothers and I all were, and we grew up with this language of this American dream. I always say my brothers and I were these little American dreams that my parents had, but the kind of American dream that they had hoped for when they left their countries for different reasons felt less and less possible to me as I got older, as I encountered especially one very difficult moment in my life in which my mom, who I read about in the introduction, who could not afford health insurance, could not afford healthcare for many years, had undiagnosed, untreated diabetes and was rushed to the emergency room and had to have her right foot amputated due to this, lack of continuous treatment and lack of access to healthcare. And that was one of the kind of moments that really changed my understanding of life in the US. And at the time, I was overcome with grief and worry about my mom and her well-being, but I was also overcome with another feeling, which I knew didn't have to be the case because I had lived in places that had universal health care, which was this question of how are we going to pay for the care that she needs moving forward? How are we going to pay for the insulin she needs to stay alive? And as I said, now I live in London and I've been a beneficiary of this wonderful universal healthcare system, the first in the world, which has its has had its ups and downs, but to me is a really wonderful example of what is possible. And not only what is possible, what is actually already happening and is practical. And so that's the personal side of things. The professional side of things is I've been a journalist in the US, well, for writing for US media for about 15 years. And during the time that I've been writing and editing and commissioning and reporting on all of these stories that oftentimes feel like we take one step forward and two steps back. On issues that really felt intractable in the US, I was experiencing firsthand in the places that I lived or visited how other countries had solved some of these problems or at least had gotten a lot further along towards solving them than we had. And Uruguay is a really wonderful example. I can't have favorites. There's nine policies in the book, but I really enjoyed being there and watching how this once very low income country, despite not having many resources, including no naturally occurring fossil fuels, came up with a very scrappy solution in around 2010 for the fact that they could not keep the lights on in their own country. So just to back up a little bit, essentially, because Uruguay doesn't have any naturally occurring fossil fuels, from the start of the 1900s, they relied very, very heavily on hydroelectric dams that still today produce actually about half of their electricity, a little bit more than half of their electricity, and through a state-owned utility, which I think is really important, that it was a publicly owned utility that the state is in charge of. So the elected representatives are, responsible when the lights go out. You had a situation in which, again, because it was quite a low-income country, whenever the oil and gas prices would fluctuate, or whenever there were droughts, which became more frequent and more severe because of the climate crisis, they just actually could not afford to keep the lights on to bring electricity into people's homes, and it caused rolling blackouts and power cuts, and it was incredibly disruptive to civilian life, to businesses. I went to a cloth factory, and they told me when the lights would go out, we would just have to put down our tools. There was nothing we could do, and just work was sort of over for that day. Um, and so what happens is that you get this Frente Amplio. I have Pepe Mujica is up there. You can kind of see him. This is the Nation published an excerpt of this chapter, who passed away actually earlier this year. And even before he comes in, he decide around 2009, 2010, he decides that he doesn't know how long this left-wing coalition party is going to be in power. And so it was really important to him and the people in his administration that certain really important key issues at the heart of Uruguayan society, key problems, had long-term plans that had cross-party agreements. And so even before he becomes president, he has his administration hammer out cross-party agreements for about four problems. And one of those is the electricity problem and the energy problem. And after a couple of months of negotiations, they decide, okay, yes, we'll appease those who still want to continue looking for fossil fuels in our, throughout Uruguay, but we haven't been able to find them. But we are going to try something that no country has really tried before. And certainly no country, I mean, no, even wealthier countries hadn't been able to manage it, which was to entirely green their grid. And again, because they didn't know how long they would be in power, they were thinking it's a 20, 25-year plan. They needed to get everyone on board. Turns out they didn't even need to get everyone on board because they were in power for the next 10 years. And during that time, they broke all records really and were able to almost entirely green their grid in the sense that they still have some fossil fuel generators that they rely on in case of emergency or in case of if there's less wind or less solar at certain moments of the day. But most of the time, they now have enough wind, enough solar, enough biomass, and certainly enough hydroelectric that they can power all of their homes, all of their factories. And at the same time as this transformation happened, you had a huge increase in use of electricity because as the country, in no small part thanks to the Frente Amplio government, went from being a lower income country to a more middle income country. People were able to afford more electrodomestic appliances and air conditioning and things like this. And so I really love this example because it just goes to show how in moments of crises, you can really come up with these and with very limited resources, you can really come up with these very scrappy, long-lasting solutions.
This was very exciting to me because it seemed to happen in less than a decade. So I'd like you to just tell us before we go on to the next area, how much energy, how much of their energy is produced by these renewable sources. And you also mentioned in the book that they do all this without battery storage. And can you
Yeah.
just say a little bit about that? You don't know in great detail, but just a little bit about why they don't need battery storage.
Yeah. So on some days you have 100% of the electricity that's generated being from renewable energy. On average over the year, it's about 98%. It depends on the year and of course and things like droughts and but generally since they've transitioned in I guess 2019 was around the time that they finished the last installing the last kind of big wind farms. They can rely on 98 to 99% renewable energy for their electric needs. And incredibly, so this was a country that was going that was going into debt that couldn't afford to pay for these fossil fuels that they were importing from neighboring Argentina and Brazil every time that they had one of these droughts. And they've gone from having to pay millions to their neighbors for fossil fuels to actually exporting excess green energy to neighboring Argentina and Brazil and actually making money off of that that then gets reinvested by the state into infrastructure and other projects.
And that is really inspiring. I wish we could get PG&E in our area to be a public utility. Then we'd have a lot more control over the sources of energy. Although many of us here are getting 100%, almost 100% of our energy from renewables through a special
Yeah.
program through them. But I wanted to go now to housing. We will get to healthcare after that, but I did want to go to housing because this is such a serious issue in our country and certainly in the area where most of us live. Affordable housing is just becoming one of the American dreams that became a nightmare over the last few decades because housing costs don't seem to relate in any way to what people are earning, especially lower and even middle class salaries. So I'd like you to talk about the Singapore solutions that you write about in the book, how they dealt with affordable housing and the campaigns how they coordinated the government. Here we coordinate, or we're talking about coordinating government, developers, and citizen groups. But the idea of public housing here still has somewhat of a stigma to it. Although, as we talked briefly before this program began about Vienna, there's no stigma to the public housing there, and certainly there isn't in Singapore. So I'd like you to tell us how the public housing project started there, the public or the Housing Development Board, which made all this possible, and how it works. What percentage do people pay? How does it work, and how do people view it?
Yeah, so just to say, I grew up partly in Los Angeles, and I went to UCLA, and so I'm very familiar with the housing crisis, with the homelessness crisis in California and certainly in Los Angeles, and it was one of the things that really inspired me to look at Singapore is that I I think housing, as you said, is such a critical issue, and they're importantly, uh, everyone from the Prime Minister of Singapore in the post-colonial, sorry, yeah, in the post-colonial era, down to people like urban planners and architects in Singapore, recognized early on that it was a really that home ownership and public housing, and this is kind of an interesting aspect of the program, which I'll explain, was going to be really key to a stable, prosperous nation, or the kind of stable, prosperous nation that they wanted to build moving forward. And so you have a situation in Singapore in which it started with a few housing developments here and there, again organized by the state, and it was a colonial housing development board that then, when they got their independence, became part of the state that started to recognize in the 80s and 90s that there were these, again, hangups from the colonial times where Singaporeans all had mandatory pension saving program plans in which every month they had employee and employer-based payments coming straight out of their paycheck, going straight from their employer into this savings plan that they couldn't really access until retirement age. And it occurred to some people within the Singaporean government that if it was possible to use some of those savings for housing, that it would actually allow people to be able to own their own homes without actually even spending a single cash dollar, Singaporean dollar from their own savings. So this kind of unlocked an entire, very radical even for today, program in which the depending on your income and your savings, you can apply for a certain size of home in a certain neighborhood. And what's really important about this is that these are all high quality homes that the people behind the architects and the urban planners, I got to interview Tai Kier Liu, who was one of the master architects of modern day Singapore. They really wanted to take that stigma away from public housing, as we were talking about. And so they've started again modestly with a few buildings here and there. And nowadays, about 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing. So talk about getting rid of the stigma. Most of the time when I would talk to people in Singapore, I would ask them questions about what they thought about living in public housing and things like that. And they said, a few of them I remember perfectly would say, "What's the problem? We all live in them. It's what we do, and it's great." And I went to visit public homes, public housing units from different periods of these, from the earliest days of this transformation to the most modern ones, so the ones that are like they're called buy to order, which are brand new. You buy them or you start to, apply for them even before the building is built. And they were all as advertised, quite high quality. Obviously, some of them are more dated than others, but they get updated by the government themselves. And um, essentially, you in it, one of the key things aside from the stability is that they've essentially eradicated homelessness through this program because the state essentially allows, or sorry, not allows, ensures that there is affordable housing, that there is housing for ownership, but also housing for rent for those who cannot afford ownership yet. And there's an example in the book of or a scholar that has looked at homelessness in Singapore. And as soon as it's come up, it's already, as soon as it was studied, the state already kind of took control of the issue and was saying, okay, well, obviously this is we hadn't really talked about homelessness, and now we're going to address it. So one of the reasons that as I was telling Georgia that I really wanted to include Singapore, even though you have a really great example in Vienna, and I'm writing a city book next, and I will be going to Vienna, is that I wanted to go to countries that had very different approaches in every sense, very different economies, that were in different parts of the world. And Singapore, to me, is even more hyper capitalist than the US is, and that no one can really dismiss it as this bastion of left wing, sort of the way that often, unfortunately, is the case with Scandinavian countries, which I did go to a couple because there are some great policies there. But I wanted to make sure to include as many kind of different places as possible.
Great. Yeah, I found Singapore very interesting, and I will be really interested in hearing your response to Vienna because it is a city, and a lot of people rent there rather than own, and it's a mixture of different income levels. So it's people with high incomes, people with low incomes, everything in between. And I think Singapore's example I had never heard of before. So it was another one where a community has dealt with the housing problem. We are in the throes of it here in Sonoma right now. So it's anywhere where we can learn things are good. But what I'm
Oh, and
seeing,
sorry.
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, Georgia. I just wanted to really quickly jump in and say that mixed income is a really key aspect of the Singapore model as well.
Right.
And that actually, there are several Californian politicians and leaders and people who work in affordable housing that are looking not just at the Vienna example, but also at the Singapore example. So when I was there most recently, I was able to speak to some people who are working on affordable housing campaigns, and they were telling me, "Oh yeah, of course, Singapore and Vienna. Those are the examples that we're interested in."
Great. Are there any particular politicians you remember that are checking these out?
Yeah, so you have Representative Alex Lee in
Alex,
Sacramento who is trying to set up, and I think is getting pretty far along, setting up an equivalent to the housing board, the housing development board in Singapore on the state level in California to specifically to build public housing that is mixed income.
great. Now you mentioned him in your book.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, right. Alex Lee, Sacramento. Okay, great. Good to know that. And good to know we have an ally right here nearby. Now I want to go to healthcare. Probably I should have started with it since you did, but it's a little more complicated what I want to get into with you. And first would be your experience in UK and the healthcare system there, because we hear these stories about, oh, you've got to wait forever to get your surgery, you have to wait forever to get an appointment, and it's propaganda because I've been there and I was hoping someone who lives there was going to be on the call because he's made use of the free healthcare in England and has had an extraordinary experience with it. And so I think we need to hear how well this works, and also maybe right after that, I'd like to have you talk about the pension system in New Zealand because I thought that was really fascinating, and it would be great to have something like that here because our Social Security, you can't live on it, not here. So I think what they created in New Zealand is really extraordinary. So let's start with England and then go to New Zealand.
Sure. So, as you know, and some of your members know, as you were talking about who live in the UK, the United Kingdom's National Health Service is the first universal healthcare system on a statewide level, and incredibly, the sort of main principles of it remain intact today, even though there have been other issues with it, which I can kind of go into a little bit, but it is publicly owned and run and funded by general taxation and free at the point of delivery. And I mean, I think that that's really the thing that as an American always strikes me is I talk about it again in the book. This experience that I had the first time I encountered this system in which I had this like, terrible eye infection and I had to go to an eye hospital. And when I went there, I remember taking out my credit card and my ID, and they sort of said, "Put those things away. We don't need any of this." And that's just kind of a smaller example. Unlike other members of my family, I've been fortunate not to have any serious health issues during my lifetime. But I have family members in the UK who are have similar health issues to my own mother in that they are pre-diabetic and have circulation issues linked to diabetes. And I've been watching the sort of journey that this family member is going on. And because of the fact that he's always had access to high quality care, free at the point of delivery, there has just been so much more monitoring of the issue, so much more knowledge about it. And all of this has made for a situation in which he may never actually get to the point that my mother has because of this continuous access to, a GP, to great hospital care. And in fact, he's in the hospital right now. When I hear about, this argument that, oh, but there are these waiting lists, and to be clear, the National Health Service has suffered due to underfunding by 14 years of right-wing government, and before that, even since the 1980s, there's been this really huge attempt to privatize certain aspects of it, and I've done some reporting on this for the nation. Um, Even so, some of the key things that I highlight as an American is that in the US we also have wait lists for certain treatments. But the difference is that at the end of the wait list in the UK, you will always have access to that care. Whereas in the US, you may have access to it, but you then are saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt, as so many people are, or you simply can't afford it because of that, or you can't even get on a wait list because you don't have the opportunity to access care because you don't have health insurance or. So there are all of these ways in which if you universalize access, you start at such a different point. And yes, of course, there are struggles. And as I often say, the this the starting point is, of course, to get universal healthcare. But what I've learned in the UK is you have to keep fighting to keep the things that you get. But people love the National Health Service so much. It's very rare to find a British person who won't, talk about how wonderful it is. Of course, they will also talk about what's wrong with it. But what I often respond is that it's great that you can see its flaws and that you want to improve it because it belongs to you. And that's how things get better. And there is nothing about the healthcare system in the US that belongs to me or my mom or any of us here on this call. And I think that that key difference, it makes all the difference.
I agree. I wanted to ask you, does the National Health Service cover dental?
So there are unfortunately not that many. It was one of the first things that they kind of whittled away very early on. And actually, I think the fact that they stopped covering glasses and dentistry was the reason that Anira Bevan, who was the founder of the National Health Service, resigned. But there are National Health Service dentists. They're hard to get, and they're just subsidized. So I can go to. I actually am very fortunate to have a National Health Service dentist a 5-minute walk from my apartment, and there's a flat fee for every visit. So I think I pay something like 29 pounds 50 for any sort of checkup or X-rays or things like this.
That's shocking. As I say sometimes when we talk about healthcare, I have dental debt, and that's huge in this country. Although I am on Medicare now because of my age, it doesn't cover dental. Bernie Sanders was trying to get it to cover that, but it doesn't. And dental prices in this country are off the charts. I mean,
Yeah.
just thousands of dollars you can be in debt from this. But we won't go into all of that right now because I want to get to the pension plans in New Zealand before I open it up for questions. Because I think it's really important for a lot of us to understand how that works. So give us a little overview of the Kiwi Save Act and how people manage.
Yeah. New Zealand's universal pension system, is really interesting to me because, and I always caveat that I don't want to be too mean about the Social Security system because I really I think it's a great program that one of the few things we have left from the
Exactly.
FDR era and it is incredibly important. That said, as you pointed out, Georgia, it's insufficient to live on. And for me, one of the roots of this problem comes from the fact that we don't have a universal non-contributory flat rate program like the one in New Zealand. And so just to kind of break that down, what that means is universal in that everyone who is a resident there for a certain amount of years, they've just recently increased it to 10 years, but everyone over the age of, I'm forgetting now if it's six, I think it's 65, has access to a flat rate pension. So everyone gets the exact same amount. And it's tied to average wages so that life continues to be affordable regardless of how much you paid into the system. And this is kind of one of the things that I personally find very frustrating as someone who sat down for many hours trying to understand Social Security is how complex it is to understand and how, the formula works and in many ways it can be progressive, but in other ways it can codify or it can sort of cement inequities that have happened throughout a lifetime because it's based on your wages and your contributions. Whereas in New Zealand, what they did was that by making it a flat rate and making it non-contributory, meaning that you don't pay into it, it's funded by general taxation. And I think that these are two of the keys to a lot of the programs I looked at. It was universal, funded by general taxation. Um, it means that much fairer to especially to women who are often underpaid or are in unpaid labor, like caregiving, and traditionally oppressed groups who suffer from income discrimination. Um, and it just sort of evens the playing field at the very minimum during retirement and ensures that people have access to a dignified retirement.
Yeah, that was very inspiring to me to read about that. That there's a flat rate that's not dependent on how much you made during your life, because really that penalizes people who've had low income jobs, and it's unfair. So I think New Zealand is a great example. And I just wanted to ask you, how long has that been in place, that
Oh,
system?
I'm forgetting the year now, but it's actually been in place since I think in different forms. They've had some form of this since the early 1900s, but I think the 1960s is when they started having this like flat rate version of it.
Great. Well, I want to open it up to questions from people on the call. I have more questions, so if they don't jump in, I've got more. But if anyone wants to put your hand up, this would be the time to do it. Um, and you can do it later because I have more questions. So, um, all right, since no one's jumping in, I'm now going to go to
Oh,
Finland. Oh,
oh,
you're
I
saying,
think Michelle,
Yeah,
did
yeah.
you?
I had a
oh,
question. So in your book, which I do want to get, I'm anxious to read that. I like to learn more about the countries like Singapore and have, historical context. Do you have a bibliography or do you have some sources in your book
yes.
Absolutely.
that that you can go back and catch up?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things about it being like newer policies in the sense that some of them have been around, as you can hear from since like the 1960s and whatnot, but others are around since the early 2000s, is that a lot of my sources were interviews and also other journalists' work. And so there are a few books in the bibliography, but certainly there are a ton of resources, and a ton of resources that go back to as well, the primary sources from the government policies themselves.
Right. And one more quick question. Is the
Mhm.
healthcare system in Canada similar to the one in the UK as far as universality?
That's a really great question. I'm not sure if they have a fully publicly owned system. If I remember correctly, they have single payer, which is what Medicare for all would be, right? Which is just that the state covers all healthcare costs. But I'm not sure if
Okay.
they have the same as the UK, where the state actually owns and runs all of the hospitals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But certainly, it's not the only example, and I think that is one of the things that actually I find really heartening is that every time I talk about one place or another, people say, "Well, what about Vienna and what about Canada?" And well, yeah,
Yeah.
because these are great ideas. They're not, unique to one place.
And as Bernie Sanders says, we're the only developed major country that doesn't guarantee health care for all. But there is one other country that doesn't, and I just recently learned it, and that's Switzerland. They don't have health care either for all. So that was surprising to me to learn that, but it's, I think, the only country in Europe that doesn't. But I wanted to mention as an add-on to Michelle's question is Natasha's book, Another World is Possible, has pages of references also in the back, but she goes into such detail and really, the interviews are extraordinary. And it seems like you get to know all these people. So it's very readable and enjoyable. And yet there's so much to learn in it. So I highly recommend the book.
Thank you for
I'm looking
sharing.
for other questions now.
But can I just add there that I really love to hear that word readable because and that you connected with the stories of the character the characters, the people, right? I wanted as much as possible to really pass the microphone as to the very real people that were in the room with me, on the streets with me when I went to these different countries because I'm conscious of the fact that I'm not from Uruguay. I haven't lived in a lot of these places. I've lived in a few of them, but not all of them. And as much as possible, I wanted them to read as stories, because I think that it makes them more memorable. But I also think it shows us that this is about real people. This is about the kinds of stories that can happen to any of us and that are very possible in the US.
And the other thing you showed that I thought was remarkable is that sometimes these projects just start with a few people. They're not from some big organization, but like in Uruguay, they start with a few people and then they work with the government. It's extraordinary to me how a few people can change everything. And you point that out too in the book. I'm looking, see if there's any questions before we go to Finland. Okay, let's go to Finland. Because you mentioned about the Finnish education system. I think that in the early 1900s, most people there did not go to school after the age of 11. And now they have the best educational K through 12 system in the world. So this is another extraordinary achievement. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about it. Of course, it's all free in Finland, I think from kindergarten through PhD level. But tell us a little bit about what you discovered in Finland with the people and how they view their educational system and how it works.
Finland, to me, is a really good example of how to address one of the key problems that I see in the US. And it's that in the US, we have these sort of off-ramps for the wealthy, in that if you are among the wealthy few, you are able to afford the best schools, the best, healthcare, the best of everything. But dis most of us, despite living in or being from the wealthiest country in the history of the planet, have little to limited access to those same excellent things. And what Finland did was essentially eliminate those off-ramps and make get rid of fee charging schools. So they don't really have private schools, so to speak, in Finland anymore. And it proves a really interesting point that if you all have to send your children to the local school, it has to become the best possible school. If you eliminate those off-ramps for other people, for wealthy people, it means that you have quite literal skin in the game in a way that if you don't, things can really deteriorate or fall apart. And I'm a product of the public education system in the U.S. But as I talk about in the book, part of the reason that I had such a great public school education system is that I borrowed a zip code from my aunt, and I had a very moving moment recently that I was talking at USC just a few days ago, also via Zoom, and a student spoke up and said that she also was at USC today, was in college today because she was able to borrow someone's address. And that made all of the difference in her life. And it was still a public school, but her local school was just not the best possible school for her and had a lot of problems. And so to focus a little bit on what Finland did is they essentially took quite a big gamble on this idea of universal public schools. And the way that they funded it is incredibly equitable in that you get funding based on the number of students you have, and you get more funding for special needs. And for, children who are learning Finnish as a second language or who are uh, or who have any sort of other needs or who come from low income families. And importantly, they also have, again, a free, paid for by general taxation, master's program for all teachers. And so the level of education, the quality of that education is standardized throughout Finland at the very core with this teacher program. But what's incredible about it is that despite it all coming from the same programs, is that teachers everywhere across the country that I spoke to told me how much autonomy they have, how much freedom they have to teach however they see fit to teach their students in their classrooms. And that was one of the things that actually I spoke to teachers who had worked in the US before through Fulbright scholarships or things like this, and who told me it was really striking to them how hard it was for teachers in the US now that you have so much standardized testing, which is another thing that they don't have in Finland. They don't really do the standardized testing. Now that you have so much standardized testing that teachers are just not able to do what they see fit for their students. And that really struck them as sort of one of the key components of the Finnish education system that's made it so successful. I could go on and on about Finland's education system. They also have free school lunches. I had one of their lunches. It was very good. And again, this is one of these things that, and I know it varies across the U.S. In some states we do have free school lunches, in some states we don't. As many teachers told me, I need to know that my students are at least getting one whole nutritious hot meal a day in order for me to be able to, as a teacher, deliver an education to them.
I thought so. The interesting things about the education, as you mentioned, that they require a master's degree in education to teach, and that the teachers have flexibility. I remember when I had roommates after college that were student teachers, and they, even after they were student teachers, it seemed like they always had to have all their plans done. Everything was kind of, it seemed very rigid to me. I thought, thank God I didn't become a teacher. I mean, that was my response when I saw what they had to prepare before they could even go into the class to teach, which took a lot of time that wasn't in the classroom. And the other thing you mentioned in there is that they don't, I think, have more than 4 hours in the classroom a day, students,
Yeah.
which, that they're supposed to be playing and outdoors and doing other things besides just sitting around. All of this is important for child development, and they seem to understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's fascinating again, so that was a little bit frustrating, was that many people told me many of the pedagogical theories that we're putting into place in our classrooms, such as, less classroom hours and more time playing, more time doing things like woodwork and
Right.
sewing and all of these and more creative things. These are actually coming from American intellectuals, from American academics. And yet we have the freedom and the ability to apply those theories in our classrooms, whereas the US education system has become so, I think, for lack of a better word, narrow-minded in many ways.
Mhm. And so test oriented, which has been really, I think, a great failing. Um, Elena, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious when you're talking about teachers, what is the pay scale for teachers in Finland? Is it more comparative to other occupations, or how does that work?
That's such a great question. Thank you for bringing it up. And it's something that I should emphasize more with the Finland example is that teachers are well paid and well respected in Finnish society. And so they have the majority of teachers are part of one union. That union is incredibly powerful because they are able to directly negotiate salaries, and the salaries are all based on the amount of time that you are a teacher. And so seniority, the longer you're there, the more you're paid. Um, and it's standardized across the board. The really key thing, I think, is that as you sort of were wondering, it is comparable to many other professions. And not only that, because you have a master's degree, if you did want to leave teaching, you are seen as a working professional when you go into the workforce. Um, Another key aspect about Finnish society that makes this work is that you have wage compression. You don't have such a huge divergence between what a software engineer makes and what a teacher makes. And that makes for a much more equitable society overall.
Yeah. Other questions? Sometimes people use the automatic hand and sometimes they don't. There were other areas that Natasha covered that are also really interesting. I don't know if we will have much time to get in. Well, we can get into maybe one of them, but I just want to list them because connected to this is Norway's family policies, family-friendly policies, as you call them. Portugal's radical drug policy, which I thought was really interesting too. And Estonia's digital technology is a human right, which is something we might look at. Costa Rica's life-saving biodiversity law, which also has brought a lot of ecotourism to the region. And even though you didn't use a chapter to it, you did mention Uganda's policies with refugees. So I thought all these things were really interesting. And a lot of them, like Uganda and Estonia, I knew a little, but not much about. Um, but I'm going to leave it up to you. Which area would you like to touch on before we finish of the ones I
Yeah.
just mentioned?
Oh, it's so tough. Again, like I said, it's so hard to pick them because I really think they're all so important. But maybe I'll just quickly talk about two in a more brief way, in that Norway is a really good example of how in the US, we're really like, I keep saying, leaving money on the table when it comes to family-friendly policies, when it comes to supporting families. They have what works out to a year paid parental leave at 100% salary for both parents that they can divide as they want to. What I really liked about it is that they have this daddy quota. That's why I chose Norway. You have a few other countries that have great parental leave and even sometimes even longer. But they were the first country to implement a daddy quota that had a take it or leave it 3 month minimum for dads to take on their own, where moms or co-parent had to go back to work or school and couldn't be at home. And that really kind of changed Norwegian society, but also changed their economy. You have, by their own calculations, one of their finance ministers said that the there's been a 20% growth in GDP since these policies have been implemented, just from women being able to actually go back and stay in the workplace when they wanted to. And importantly, and this is something that I'm seeing a lot with my friends who are having young children, childcare is highly subsidized, and they have highly subsidized childcare for every child from the age of 1. And that is, it's about just under $400 a month per child. And they have discounts if you have more children in daycare. And I think this is such an important thing. But in the US is one of the only countries, certainly one of the only wealthy countries in the world that doesn't have statutory state-backed maternity leave even, let alone parental leave. But childcare is such an issue. But again, this is really exciting to me, is you've not only seeing, Zohar Mamdani in New York running on one of his campaign promises being free childcare, but actually New Mexico already implementing free childcare. And again, I'm sure we're going to see a ton of studies that are going to show all of the economic and social and psychological benefits of this.
Mhm.
And then just very, very briefly, the reason that I really think Estonia is interesting is that, as someone who's had to navigate the serpentine bureaucracy of being able to access certain things such as disability payments for my mom, or Medicare, Medi-Cal, and all of these different programs that I'm again really grateful to exist. And have been a lifeline for my mom eventually once I was able to get them for her, unfortunately very late in her health journey. I have seen what Megan Day from Jacobin Magazine calls austerity through bureaucracy, in that it is so difficult to fill out this paperwork and is oftentimes actual literal physical paperwork still. And you have to constantly keep on top of it because from one day to the next, I will, my mom will be able to have her insulin covered and the next day it's not covered. It's just from one piece of paper that wasn't filed correctly. And that has been completely done away with in Estonia, where they have this incredible citizen portal that everyone has access to. Their own, and it's very secure, and as a citizen, log in and can do anything from get married online to renew your driver's license to uh,
Paying taxes.
pay taxes in a few seconds, which and not and for free, which I think again as an American, I can't believe that we have to, pay for these third-party services. And I go into it a little bit in the book. There's a history and financial incentive, and of course, you have like TurboTax and these companies behind why it's so hard to file taxes in the
Right.
US and why it costs money. But that said, when I was thinking about all of these great programs and policies and how to implement them, how to make them effective, how to make them efficient, it seemed to me that the Estonia example was a really kind of key aspect to that effectiveness and that ability to redistribute.
Yeah, great. Any other questions before we close?
So I just have a comment. I thank you so much for sharing what your book is about and all that. I actually teach at a community college and I teach innovation. And I already have an idea I've never had a required textbook for my class. But I might use yours.
Oh, that's
And
so kind.
and I was thinking of maybe assigning, an interview, an interview that you have done in some country to have a student deal with it. So thank you.
Oh, please get in touch with me. Georgia has my email, and it's actually just my full name at Gmail. And I would happily even come and talk to the class if you'd like me to. And
Oh,
also,
great.
I'll talk to the new press about maybe getting a discount for your students.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh,
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's
I think
great. Wonderful. I love to see these things come out of an event. Katie, you have your hand up? You will, I think you're,
Yeah, just a quick comment and a thank you also. It was really, really fascinating and such a gift to give to the human population, to all of us. I just had a couple thoughts. The latest movie, The Blue Zones, the latest, yeah, they had a nice piece there. I believe it was relating to Singapore. Highly recommend, of course. Looks like you're well aware of it. They have the new one out. And also, of course, the obvious thing here is that the thing that is necessary at the root of this is to have systems or people in politics who actually have values that have to do with serving the people. That's an impossibility at the moment in this country, as far as I can tell. But I just think it's wonderful, and I want to encourage your next book about how just keep letting us know about how systems can really support societies, because having a new vision is half the battle, I mean, it's imperative. The suffering, at least that I know I have experienced with housing, is just
mm,
another whole hour. Yeah.
yeah. Housing here is really, really difficult.
It's really just
But so is healthcare, and so is,
so you're right. Yes. It's inhumane.
yes, it's inhumane. I want to live in Spain where it's more humane.
Yeah.
Okay, we are almost at the hour. Alana, I will just take a last question from you. Go ahead, Alana.
Okay. Um, Sort of to follow up a little on what Katie was mentioning about the current mindset, and also because I'm looking at where we are right now in this poly crisis of pretty much every one of those issues is screaming at us at the same time.
Mhm.
And my sense from listening to you is that you're talking a bit more about things that bubble up from the bottom than maybe trickle down from the top. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how these great successes have occurred and which way they go, or do they meet in the middle? Just your thoughts would be great.
Thank you, Alana. Yeah, and I just want to highlight again that, as Georgia said, and I talk about this at the end of the book, is that a lot of these policies come from these moments of crises, from these really dark periods in these countries' histories. And so I really hear the concern that right now it feels really impossible to think that there are people in elected office, certainly at the national scale, that would want to get something like universal healthcare passed. Certainly there's a lot more sort of destruction going on than construction. That said, I am really hopeful about so many things in the U.S., and I have a really strong belief in the ability of the American people to really get amazing things done. You know, this is the country of this like incredible civil rights movement, of the LGBTQ movement. We have managed so much, and I really believe that a lot more is possible, and that we are many and they are few, and that our collective power is what we need to rely on for this. I think, especially in the case, and so there's a real mix in the book of, you know, where they come from, and I like this idea of meeting in the middle, because sometimes I really think that you need good leaders, and I talk about this, but you need those leaders to come from all parts of society. Um, and then to kind of be people powered, because one of the problems we have certainly in the US is that even if we get some great people elected, we don't have strong movements, and we don't have, you know, like a big workers' party like you do in the UK with the Labour Party, that can keep them accountable. And so it's much harder to sort of ensure that those people sort of stick to those values when that happens. I mean, some people like Bernie Sanders, I can continue regardless, right? And it's great that we have people like him. Um, so at the same time, I'm really heartened by what's possible on a local scale, even when on a national scale things feel impossible. And that's partially, so my second book is going to be called Another City is Possible. I'm already working on it now because I am interested on what can happen on a smaller scale. But a lot of these policies, you know, one of the questions I get, and I tried to preempt from the very beginning, is like, well, a lot of these, no country that you look at is as big or as diverse as the United States. And I take that, but I also recognize that even if Los Angeles could take a page out of the Singapore chapter, millions of Americans would have much, much better lives, would have their lives materially improved immediately if we had a program like this. And so there's a lot that I think can be done, even now, even during this really difficult period, that we can't lose sight of. And, you know, again, I talked about Zohar Mamdani in New York running on things that I didn't even consider was possible to run on in the United States, like municipally owned grocery stores. I'm not 100% sure how it's going to work, but I'm thrilled to see that it could happen, and I'm excited to maybe one day write about him and these grocery stores, certainly about the free childcare, which I really hope that they'll pass, and free buses. But I also want to point, and now it's the statistic is getting a little bit dated, but last year during the November general election, you had these sort of what we would consider sort of deep red states like Nebraska, Alaska, and Missouri, not just increasing the minimum wage, but also passing paid sick leave on their state ballots through state-led initiatives that to me, and sometimes with huge majorities, I think in Nebraska it was like 75% of the vote, that to me proves the point that no matter what you call these policies, do you call them left or right or progressive or whatever, when they make a material difference to people's lives and people feel the real impact of it, they kind of defy the political spectrum. And I've seen that with the National Health Service, you know, where the conservatives did not want the system to be put into place, and now they take credit for it. And so I'll leave you with a quote that I often paraphrase or misquote from Myron Bevin, the founder of the National Health Service, where he talks about how some of these we're so close to the National Health Service becoming so popular that even our enemies will want to take credit for it. And I have seen that in the UK and in many other places. So I would just say don't lose hope even now and think on a local scale, think on a national scale. It's not going to last forever, and these we will come out of this dark period and hopefully stronger than before.
Thank you so much, Natasha. This has been really a wonderful hour. I want to talk to you separately because I want to give you some contacts. And
Absolutely.
yeah, because I think what you're going to be doing in the next book is equally important. And thank you for those of you who've come to this live, and others who register will get the video tonight. So I'm going to end the recording. Oops.